Okay, welcome everybody. I thought we would just start with a very quick round of introductions, so starting with Matt on my left.
Hello everyone, Matthew Chung. I'm the CIO for Technology and Information Risk for Morgan Stanley. I'm also the head of cybersecurity for the firm. I work out of our New York headquarters. Been there for about 4 years. My career has all been in financial services, all the big bulge bracket universal banks. Prior to Morgan Stanley, I was the Chief Operating Officer for EMEA for Barclays, as well as the Group Chief Information Security Officer and Head of Governance, Risk and Control. Thanks.
And Pierre?
Hello everyone, my name is Pierre Legrand. I work for PwC. I'm the Chief Technologist for Advisory Function, and I run our technology consulting business for Southeast Asia. I've been in around technology for about 20 years. And funny enough, little anecdote, I haven't seen this guy in over 15 years, and I found out that he was on the panel, and it's the first time that we've seen each other in 15 years having worked at Barclays together, so I'm pretty excited.
Hi, good afternoon, folks. My name is Miles Hosford, and I lead the financial services compliance team at Amazon Web Services. So I basically work with our customers around the region to establish security and governance processes when they move to the cloud. So thank you and happy to be here.
Thank you. Right, so I thought when I was putting this panel together that I would start really with my perspective on cloud computing. And this might be awkward, I suppose, but I come at this from a place of slight frustration. You see, Alan Overy, I'm a lawyer, and I want to use legal tech startups, and oftentimes they are creating massive efficiencies for lawyers, but I get to the point where I try and actually utilize the technology, and my financial institution client will often tell me that they don't allow me to use that technology. And so for me, it's actually extremely frustrating process, and it's with that lens that I put together the questions that we're going to be asking the panel today. So I suppose we need to start really at the beginning, which is with the advantages of cloud computing over a conventional data center. Pierre, maybe you would.
Yeah, I love that there's numerous sides to both of that element of the equation. But when we look at traditional data centers that corporate enterprises undertake, a lot of those are limited by scale of capital investment and what's happening in the market from a cost perspective. The second thing is that the way compute, storage, and network are provisioned in those environments are very much around supporting business applications and technologies that are typically deployed by the enterprise, which are usually quite important, but also limited in scale and scope and technology breadth of what the divisions and the IT departments are used to delivering as banks versus technology companies. It's a very important point, and I'll make that distinction. Whereas if you're a technology company where your sole mission in life is about provisioning compute, which you will attest to, provisioning storage, where that is your modus operandi in terms of applying evergreen, applies of real-time provisioning in terms of DevOps, in terms of refreshing your hardware, it is a completely different environment. So the advantages that you get is this scale, this ability to adopt new hardware, implement compute scale quicker, deliver services in a much faster way, simply because that is the way your business works. That is a technology company as opposed to a bank. So when you look at a cloud or a bank or a mining company or telco, usually the ethos is very different than a pure technology company whose sole purpose is on provisioning these environments at scale. So that's a fundamental difference between the two.
Miles, maybe?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think obviously cost is important, but I think you really called out a really key benefit there, and it's agility. And I think a lot of customers or procurement teams focus on the cost, but it's really important to remember the agility that you get when you move to the cloud. And not just from a hardware and a service and a compute perspective, but AWS, as an example, has been in business for over 12 years now. And over the last couple of years, you've seen a shift to more managed services. So things like artificial intelligence and machine learning just out of the box. So instead of having to build up a data science team and a data engineering team, you essentially get access to these capabilities at the click of a button and in real time. So we really moved past the kind of the compute and storage, which are the basic bare bones, into this world of managed services, and that's where you really drive the business value. 3 days ago, I think in Singapore, we announced that we've just launched Amazon SageMaker, which is a fully managed machine learning platform for the financial services teams to have the ability to just press go and start to use that and consume it. I think it's game-changing from an agility perspective for the organizations.
Right, so far, so good, it seems to me. But when I, from my law firm perspective, started to dig into this a bit deeper, people started talking to me about the different models of cloud. And I think it's helpful for everyone to start from the same base level of understanding. So perhaps, Pierre, you could elaborate on what's out there and why we have different models of cloud.
Yeah, and there's a good reason. I mean, in the end, in terms of cloud, it's about, really about the provisioning of specific technology components from compute to storage to network, all in provisioning services. And some of those services may be required to be delivered in a regulated environment. And as a result, you may see the concept, and I'm dumbing this down, but you may see a concept of a private cloud, which is some sort of cloud implementation that's within an environment that's managed on your behalf. So you were talking about managed services. That may be in a physical location that is either sequestered or on your premise, but that may have some of the hardware and hardware capabilities that would be deployed in a cloud. The second would be sort of a hybrid environment where you would have some of your private machines interfacing with some of the public cloud elements as well. So you'd have a little bit of both deployed. And then you have a pure public cloud where this is where you go out to AWS or Azure, where your workloads are fully deployed in the cloud, fully in a distributed environment. And don't think about it's just one physical location. It may be stripped over a number of different locations. So those are the typical deployments. And then within there, you have the way services that are delivered, from infrastructure to software to platform to communication to different styles of services that are delivered.
So hearing you talk about the various different models, in particular the private instance, it would feel to me that that should be the end of this conversation, and that someone like Matt at Morgan Stanley should be happy to use technology that is cloud-based. So that's not the case. I thought it would be helpful to just move on then to the risks involved in using cloud. Maybe Matt, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think the distinction between public, private, and hybrid is very important, as Pierre laid out. The fact of the matter is, for companies, for private companies, we are beholden to our regulators, and by that I mean we are highly regulated. Whether you're in financial services or you're in energy, you have regulators that want to make sure that you are operating within control, within governance, understanding your risks, and in control. And so the journey from legacy today to true public cloud is not that simple, right? The question around how do you manage your key risks, like how do you manage PII in the cloud, is obviously a big question. Remember, our regulators will hold us accountable, hold the firm accountable for a breach, not for the cloud service provider. So there's a level of comfort that has to be determined when moving from a private cloud construct to a public cloud construct. There's also a bit of a trust me trade that occurs when you start to move your data and your workflows into the cloud. You still have to be able to tell your clients where their data is, who has access to that data. Essentially, you have to explain to them data lineage, right? So when you log in, where does your data go? Where is it stored? Who has access to that data? If there is a breach, who do I talk to? Do I talk to you as the company, or do I talk to the provider? So this becomes a real classic supplier management problem, right? So where a private enterprise using an outsourced function like the cloud is still responsible for all the workloads, all the data that sit there. And so you have to be able to govern that in some way. And there is a bit of opaqueness. Like in a private cloud, you own the stuff, you own the kit, you own the workflow. Once you start to transition out into the public cloud, it becomes a little bit more opaque.
And just picking up on the question you've just mentioned about data lineage, what is the implication of having your information stored in various different geographical regions for you as a bank?
Well, there's a lot of sovereign laws and regulations that require data to be domiciled in the country. Probably the best example of that in financial services, maybe 20 years ago, Switzerland, right, for data privacy or for client privacy purposes. You've got a lot of new cyber laws, whether they be in China, the one that just passed in Russia in January, India, that talk about ensuring that data of citizens sit in that country. So when you start to move to a cloud construct, obviously you want elasticity, right? You want to be able to use the services that an Amazon or a Google or IBM or a Microsoft can provide for you. A lot of those things are global in nature, right? So it becomes, when you start to do that, and we kind of talked about it a bit earlier, Pierre, when you start to talk about that sort of cost-benefit analysis, when you have these kinds of regulations and these laws that require data to be domiciled in a particular country, you lose some of that flexibility in terms of where you can spread that data around.
And Miles, what trends are you seeing on this particular topic?
Yeah, good question. And I think before I get into the data localization item, I think we focused on cost as a benefit, and we've mentioned agility. But I think we've maybe overlooked, at risk of poking the bear here, that probably the main benefit of moving to a hyperscale public cloud is security and compliance, and the uplift that you're going to get as a regulated organization from your cloud provider. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the way that the public cloud model works, is the service provider, be it AWS or another public cloud provider, is responsible for controls up to a certain level. And cloud providers like AWS appreciate that security is a top priority of financial services. So they've really got to get that right. And I think there's a significant investment on the service provider side of investing in kind of industry standards and global programs like ISO 27001, SOC 1 and SOC 2 to really uplift the control environment for all customers that use the cloud. Now, from a data localization perspective, we do realize that financial services are highly regulated and they need to meet their requirements. So I think a good approach that public cloud providers take, and particularly speaking on behalf of AWS, is when you can kind of take your global infrastructure that provides you global resiliency and kind of global scale, but be able to select within that global infrastructure where your data will be at any point in time. And the approach that we've taken at AWS is to break that into physical regions all around the world. We currently have 18 of them. We have one in Singapore, and you mentioned India and elsewhere in Asia. But as a customer of the public cloud of AWS, you can choose where that data goes at any point in time. So if you choose Singapore, or you choose kind of Frankfurt or India, the data will reside there, and you kind of have the data lineage around who's accessing it, from where and when, which is very powerful when you move to a cloud environment.
Shruti, I'm just going to add a really important point. I'm going to ask you a question, get you engaged in the panel. So you were talking about these concerns and risks in the cloud.
Yes.
I often ask folks about the concerns and risks within your own environment. How aware are you? Because when I asked people, I said, have you actually ever stepped foot in your own data center? Have you ever stepped foot and looked at the environment? Do you know how many security people that you have that engage in the security activities? And you don't need to answer.
I was going to tell you, my information security head ignores all my emails, so that's my engagement with our...
But the reason why I asked that question, and for all of you to get engaged, is we for many years have treated an internal environment almost like a black box, that there was a tap that just turned on, and we assumed internally that worked. We didn't know that there were 3 security people working, that they were working 24/7. We didn't know how logical or physical access worked. But one of the things that comes with cloud, and PwC has gone in the journey of moving to cloud in itself, is whether you go to an AWS or a Microsoft or a Google, you're comparing handfuls of security staff in your company versus thousands of the best people in the business working at some of these cloud providers. Their data centers are at the highest tiers of data center capability, whereas yours may not be. And yours is also limited potentially by investment that is under constraint, right, at some points in time. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, but what I typically advise all of us is to look at the balance of risk, because it's that balance that's really important of measuring where the risk is really at and working, as Matt was saying, with the regulators on how to manage that risk in the most effective way. Because in some cases, you actually get more control and more results against compliance going to a cloud environment than you could actually ever invest in internally.
I think Miles and I think Pierre, I think those are spot on. I do think, though, that there is the underlying question, really, for me, as it boils down to the question of multi-tenancy, right? So if you think about the model, if you think about the business model, one of the things that we need to understand, especially when we talk about things like insider risk, firms have to understand when an individual that works for AWS or Google, whatever, for a cloud service provider, is actually on the system and accessing data. Now, I understand there's encryption, masking, tokenization, I get that. But the question becomes, I fully agree with the fact that you get, from a cyber perspective, you get the network effect, right? You will see a lot more data, you'll see a lot more breach attempts, you'll get a lot more threat intelligence against your infrastructure than a single company could. But the issue becomes it's really around containment. If there is a breach on one side of one portion of the cloud, how do we prevent it from bleeding across, and how do we prevent it from bleeding back into the company? Right? And I think those are the fundamental questions that we've got to ask when we talk about going full public cloud. That seems to me that's where the stepping stone is, right? Trying to get that answer.
Yeah, and I think to add to that point, you mentioned it that in a multi-tenant environment, you're going to see potentially more attacks, but the benefit of that is that you get that extra threat intelligence. And AWS, as an example, has millions of monthly customers running on the platform. And if you take millions of monthly customers and times it by the number of events you're going to see, we're going to get unique insight into who the bad guys are, what they're doing on the internet. And to Pierre's point, the investment that cloud providers can then make on behalf of the customer, we can bring out cybersecurity products to market faster than probably an individual bank could do. And taking the lessons learned from all of these customers around the world, not just in financial services, but in healthcare, manufacturing, and military and government agencies, I think it really allows an individual company that maybe doesn't have a significant investment in security themselves to leverage this shared platform that's protected by the cloud provider. From the lessons learned from the millions of customers that run on it. Yeah.
Well, just because you poked this bear, I'm going to poke this bear to ask a question about cost, because you all seem united in the view that there are cost efficiencies in using cloud, but I suppose the converse is that you could easily lose track of costs. And how do you assess the different model, I suppose, for the uneducated amongst us? How do you assess the different models in using cloud and the cost implications that has, and in using something which has unlimited flexibility and agility versus something which is slightly more restrained? So I'm open to any of you, really.
Maybe I'll take the first swing at that. You're right. So moving to a cloud environment, it does allow your developers to have flexibility that probably they didn't have before. So if you think about an on-premise world, the developer would have to request probably from group IT or group infrastructure a deployment, and that would take 6 to 9 months maybe in some organizations to get access to those resources. In public cloud environments, that's almost instant. If you want a server or a database or some storage, it's right there at the fingertips of the developers. But one of the great things about public cloud environments is almost every interaction with the cloud is via an API. So if you're making an API call into the cloud to provision hardware or logical hardware, that can be tracked and monitored and recorded with a kind of a granular level of visibility that you couldn't have got before. So, a good example that I use is in an on-premise world, if someone went into your data center and tried to make a firewall rule change, right? So they've gone into the data center, they've maybe badged in physically, and then they've gone to the hardware and maybe pulled out cables and logged into systems and made some changes. Very rarely any of that activity would be thoroughly logged and made available to security teams and also cost and procurement teams. Now in a cloud environment, all of that activity that I've just described is logged and stored indefinitely. So if you want to go back in time kind of last year or the year before and see who provisioned that database or made that firewall rule change and from what IP address or from what office within the bank, you're going to get all of that visibility and be able to action against it. So I think the benefit of being able to move fast and agile for your development teams, combined with the visibility that you're going to get, is really powerful to organizations.
So another angle on the cost play is having done a lot of this work around cloud assessment and cost, there's sometimes customers find that if you were to take a point-to-point view of workload deployment, that it actually costs more to go to cloud. But I need to qualify that because it's very short-termist. What I try to advise people is you have to look at a long-term journey. Take 2 cycles of hardware refresh, where you have to significantly refresh, and that was one of my jobs when I was working with Matt at Barclays, where you have to significantly refresh your entire platform at some time because you are the custodians of the hardware. So if you were to look at just a compute-based view of cost, you are not creating a business case that's actually comparative. The comparative case is a 4 to 8 year refresh cycle where you have to invest in your data center, you have to invest in replacing the hardware, and that comes with man hours intensiveness plus the actual hardware. The second thing that people don't pay a lot of attention to is the deployment of new software features onto the platform, or new platforms or new services that are just available. So you turn on a switch and it's available. So if you look at your EC2 console, all of these services are just there. They just appear miraculously. Whereas if you were to manage your own platform, you would have to have development capability that's continually doing that at a cost. So really, when looking at the cost of cloud computing, you have to have a view of an entire service delivery that's real time, that's agile, that's rapid, and that's over a term, as opposed to, is a single level of compute cheaper than another level of compute, which is not a correct analysis.
Yeah, great point. And I think also it's important to kind of, when you move to the cloud, you have an opportunity to reimagine what your infrastructure looks like as well. So, taking your point there, let's say that on-premise you have 100 servers or 100 instances of compute. When you move to the cloud, do you still really need 100 instances of compute? Given that the way that the cloud can scale up and down on demand, maybe for the most part of the year you could get away with 50 instances and then just spike up to kind of the 100 as and when you need to. Also, there's a big kind of movement within the cloud organizations for something called serverless. And in the serverless kind of versions of software, you only actually pay for the resources as and when you use them. So for databases, for example, you only pay on the writes or the reads to the database, and you're not really paying for the 24/7 running of that instance as well. So there is an opportunity to reimagine what infrastructure looks like in the cloud.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I do think Pierre he's hit it on the head. I think it's a bit of a journey to get to a full cloud-based architecture, and from a cost perspective, there are some startup costs, or there's some initial costs. So large global companies tend to have large global data centers, and those are under lease for a long time, and there's underlying cost built in there. So I think the concept of going through a couple of refresh cycles is absolutely key. I think so. When you do the initial analysis, especially for big global organizations, and I'm not talking financial services, I'm just talking generally, you've got a lot of sunk cost that's sitting on the books. So it's not an instantaneous journey in terms of moving from where you are legacy to where you want to be in terms of cloud. Also, there is the problem of legacy stuff, right? Legacy applications specifically. You've got to rewrite those things. Those were never written to be cloud aware. And so all that has to get changed. So there is a bit of, I think to your point, there's a bit of an upstart cost. And then hopefully as you go out, it starts to streamline.
Well, I don't want to dwell on the risks for too long, but I feel like the elephant in the room that probably needs just a bit of a thought is the idea of data breaches, and whether we are, for all the hype and the discussion around it, in your view, do we think that these are genuinely a genuine risk today, and if so, do we think the bigger risk comes from inside an organization or from outside of an organization? And I suppose I would address that to all three of you.
So I'll start at the back end and work my way forward. I think when you talk about insiders versus outsiders, remember, anyone that's trying to, any bad actor that's trying to create a data breach is most likely going to assume an identity of an insider. right? One of the first things that a bad actor will do is to steal credentials. Second thing is they're going to try and escalate privilege. And then third thing they're going to do is try to move laterally, right? So I think that there is a insider outsider. I'm not sure it matters. I think the insider threat is a keen one. Remember, there is the bad actor, an external bad actor, assuming the credentials of an insider, but there's also a disgruntled insider, right? That may do something untoward or malicious. I think the whole conversation around data breach is relevant, and the media is full of them. So if you think about, there's enough press around individual companies being breached, and there's enough press about cloud vendors that are in the cloud that are being breached. I do think, and I think Miles was talking about this a bit earlier, it is really about the level of controls that you have implemented. Remember back in the day when we used to outsource IT organizations and IT kit, if you had bad processes before internally and when you outsourced it, you typically had bad processes out there. So you've got to be able to, your workloads, your workflows, I should say, should be cognizant of the controls you need to put in place. So when developers are building inside the cloud, they should be following secure SDLC practices. If you don't do that, then the possibility of a data breach still exists, whether you're in the cloud or whether you're in a private cloud.
So being an eternal optimist, I'm keen to sort of try and move into, okay, well, here are the risks, but what can one do about it? From the service provider perspective, you've talked about a few different things with respect to each of the risks, and it seems to me like what you're saying as a general ethos is that you take the flexibility, but where you need to, you restrain it to ensure that you are able to provide a service to the customers that meets all of the various requirements. Does that feel like a fair summary, or?
Yeah, so I think if I was to summarize the model and what kind of organizations need to do to make sure they have a good, successful journey on the cloud is, first of all, to have a really good understanding of this concept of the shared responsibility model. So what is the service provider doing for me, and how do I know that that's accurate? And that's largely taken care of by contract or compliance reports like SOC 1, SOC 2, and the other independent audit reports that the service provider would provide. And then on the other side of the shared responsibility model, so what the bank or the financial institution themselves are responsible for, and Matthew made a great point, you need to have secure processes and governance around how you operate the cloud on your side as a customer of a cloud provider. How cloud service providers can help customers do that right is a few things. First of all, just providing secure defaults for everyone on services that they provide. So, when a developer within an organization wants to launch a new technology stack, as far up the stack as possible, the service provider can control, making sure there's appropriate controls at all layers of that. And then secondly, I think as an organization, because everything is an API when you use cloud environments, it allows you to actually kind of blueprint good security best practices. At Amazon Web Services, we have a service called CloudFormation. So once you've really designed one secure system once, and you've had that approved by your cybersecurity teams and independent auditors and all the relevant stakeholders, you can basically take that blueprint time and time again and deploy it for as many applications as you need, knowing that the controls are always there each and every time. And I think that drives consistency, and it removes human error because you don't have kind of humans configuring the systems time and time again. And what we're actually seeing is a move to internal audit teams actually auditing these blueprints rather than the running systems. And I think when you move to that sort of concept where you're auditing controls that are defined in code, that becomes really powerful for both internal auditors and actually regulators that want to see that these controls exist before they've had a chance to kind of misconfigure the environment. So that's something that we're seeing across AWS right now.
So for me, there's a more fundamental question I ask. The first is, who's accountable for the data, right? Because we can talk about all the security we want, but ultimately, what is the data? Why is it there versus there? Who decides whether it goes there or there? And what segregation do you apply? And I think really where my advice is at a more business level is that you first have to have some level of accountability about your data and understand the type of data that you have and the positioning and the placement of that data. So really in different environments of cloud, you may even adopt a different security posture, right? You may even decide that certain elements of that data do not go in the cloud. Or if they do go in the cloud, there's a certain level of encryption, the way that and how the keys are held. But you have to understand your data. What I try to advise my customers is that don't believe that security, governance, and controls are the only measures by which your data is protected. Because in some cases, they will still get breached. The question you have is, how did you manage that data? How did you understand what that data was? I know for this guy, I'm preaching to his domain.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think if you think about a lot of companies today, I'm sure you've seen many of them, both of you. How many companies actually do data classification in the right way? I'm sure some of them do, and I'm sure some of them don't. If you don't do data classification in the right way, you really don't know, to your point, how to protect that data. I mean, how much do you care about PII? Everyone understands PII, but what about the non-public stuff? What about the non-public information or that sensitive, the sensitive class of information? So I think you're spot on. If you're not doing that kind of, if you're not governing data up front like that, moving it someplace else isn't going to help you, right? And so you've got to be able to, it's the shared responsibility model. You have to understand your data. And the question you ask is, to me, is quite specific. The answer is quite specific, which is, if it's my client, it's my data, right? And so I've got to make sure that I can put hand on heart, and when we talk to a regulator, talk to an auditor, or talk to the client, and I have to be able to say things like, I know your data is important, I know where it is, and we're doing everything we can to protect it, and here are the things that we're doing, right? And I think that's really the ultimate goal. I think cloud is inevitable. I do think, though, that you have to have those controls wherever the data sits.
And that moves very neatly to my next question, actually, which was going to be the additional considerations that financial institutions have, because as a lawyer, I deal with a variety of different sectors, but the big red flags often come from my financial institution clients. So why is that? And where on the journey do you think the financial institutions are? And where do you think it's realistic for us to get?
I'll just speak broadly. I think there have been several studies in terms of where big financial services institutions are in that journey to the cloud. I think it's interesting. A lot of companies will say that we are all in the cloud, but they're still opening up data centers, right? So I do think today, because of the things that we talked about, getting that level of comfort, and some of that is true, and some of it is just what's perceived in terms of those risks that we talked about earlier. I think most financial services organizations, not all, because they're at the full end of the spectrum, I think most of them are in that hybrid space at the moment. And I think the reason for that is, for the things that we just talked about, it is gaining a level of comfort that the state of controls in which you are moving to is equal to or better than, hopefully better than, where it's coming from. And so I think that journey is still going. I also think that there are companies, big banks have been around for a long time. They've got a lot of legacy stuff, and we talked about that a bit earlier. So from an economics perspective, sometimes there isn't a rush to get to a cloud construct yet.
Okay, well, the final question that I have before we move on to the questions from the audience, as I say, I'm an optimist, I like to get myself into a good place, is for those who are considering a move into cloud computing, what should they do to set themselves up for a good, successful journey, sort of bearing in mind everything that you've said? And it's kind of interesting to hear all of your perspectives, I think.
From my perspective, I think probably the most important thing is to make sure that your security, risk, and governance teams are engaged early. I think if I look around the customers in the region and probably globally, the most successful journeys to AWS have been when security, risk, governance, line 1, line 2 risk teams are part of that journey very early. And that allows kind of two things. First of all, for them to clearly establish what their requirements are to move to the cloud. And also, I mean, if it's a net new project for them, it gives them a lot of time to ramp up and reskill themselves for what is potentially a change of operating model when they move to the cloud. So I would say, in addition to many other things, that engaging the right teams early. It might be very tempting for maybe business teams or application teams to go to the cloud, design something, and then try to launch to production, very fast. But if you haven't taken your governance and risk teams with you on that journey, it could potentially be a challenge for you that needs to be addressed. So I think the right people early is what I would say.
So one of the things that I love to talk about is imagine reinventing your business. Cloud allows you an opportunity to say goodbye legacy, hello, new world. And if you're in that new world, the first question you got to ask yourself is, how can I use this platform to fundamentally differentiate the way I'm going to engage with customers, the way my colleagues are going to work in my business, and the way we're going to disrupt the industry? That's the first strategic question I ask. Because if the first approach is around cheaper infrastructure or, or having the latest software as a service, solution, what business outcome are you really trying to resolve? And in today's market, the disruption is happening so quickly, you have to really have a view of how you can differentiate. Then you say, okay, if I understand what that differentiation is, what are the services and the platforms that will underpin that, the capabilities to do that? And having done this numerous times, maybe 8 out of 10 times you're going to have a set of really strong cloud services, but you'll, as Matt said, you will always have internal services that you'll need to provision, so you won't get rid of the data centers or stuff that you need. But it really gives companies a chance to reimagine their business. And I actually think the limiting factor is not a risk or compliance one. It's an imagination of how different you can make your business when you can open ML out of the box. That's the real question. How am I going to use it? Can I use it? And then let's have the security discussion. Yeah,
and I think to add to that, I think we've just spent the last 30 minutes looking at this from probably a large financial services organization lens where we've all kind of come from or are, but I'm sure there's many people in the audience that come from Fintax, and Fintax have an opportunity, to your point, Pierre, about reimagining the way that they're going to treat IT. And while it's likely that a number of large financial organizations will be in a hybrid mode, at the moment, Fintax don't have legacy technology debt. They can push changes to production this afternoon. They can launch a new product in days. And really, as a large financial institution, you're really competing with the technology burden that you may be currently carrying. When Fintax, hundreds of them over the next 3 days, they start off with a blank piece of paper and have access to these capabilities at a click of a button at a moment's notice. So I think it's something to think about there for large financial institutions.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to the questions from the audience. Because I'm so naughty, I'm not going to go with the most popular question first, mostly because my husband worked at Lehman Brothers and I watched The Big Short on the plane from London to Singapore. I'm going to ask the question that most resonates with me, which is, are cloud providers entering the same too big to fail as banks a while ago? If no, how is it different? And if yes, how are the risks being mitigated?
Is that for me?
Yes, I think so. Very clearly.
What I would say is, and I mentioned it earlier, the way that the cloud infrastructure and operating model is defined is that customers have access to this global infrastructure. And that provides really two things. First of all, it allows banks and other financial institution organizations to have true global resiliency. So if we're talking about risk or operational risk of outages and impact to the financial ecosystem, I think you already are leveling up your control environment by being able to be in 18 cities or countries around the world at the click of a button. And then secondly, from an operational risk perspective, by leveraging the shared responsibility of the cloud model and passing on the burden of, I won't say half, but a large number of the controls that you might originally have been, responsible for, it allows the financial institutions to actually focus their time elsewhere on business development, application changes. So I would say by leveraging the global platform, it actually probably reduces your operational risk by being able to either leverage the global infrastructure or rely on the service provider's existing controls.
Again, I'm going to look at it in a very different way. So how many people ask the question, of the largest banks in the world, how many were running IBM mainframes? Let's say Z series. All of them. So if IBM passed on a bad firmware upgrade or a patch, how is that different from the question that's being asked now? In some basic level, right? And I go back to everyone, and Boeing has the same issue, or Airbus could have the same issue if there's a systemic problem with one of the planes that get shipped out. There could be thousands of these that are out there. I think the real question that we're asking ourselves is, what services do we need? What do we put out in those clouds? What are the risks associated with them? Are they too big to fail? I don't know. They're distributed, data's sharded. We don't know in some cases where it is. There's a number of measures that the cloud providers such as AWS and Microsoft and Google have taken that really understand this level of regionalization and how to use this data and secure it. So I'm less concerned about that. I think the risks that I'm most concerned about in the cloud is, really around, have I truly understood from a compliance perspective, sovereignty? Do I understand where the data is going to be? Matt talked a little bit about that. But if you're not, if you think that just your environment internally versus an external environment is some protection from breach, that's going to happen anywhere. That's not my biggest concern. It's how do we protect our customers from regulation and concentration?
Yeah, I think we're spending a lot of time on one question, but I think this one's an important one. I do think that the underlying architecture in the cloud is inherently distributed, right? So there's a distributed architecture, which is the most resilient, much different than the IBMs back in the day. However, I do believe that there is concentration risk, right? So in the doomsday scenario where you have contagion moving across the cloud infrastructure now, at a high level it's easy to say, but in reality it's very difficult to do. You have a potential of taking out a lot of infrastructure in terms of sovereign infrastructure. It's a problem. Do I think that the current architecture is well suited for resiliency? I actually do. I actually do think the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles do a very good job in this regard.
Thank you. Okay, so then moving on to, I suppose, a more practical consideration when you're using the cloud. I love this question. It says, encrypt your data on the cloud, but keep your encryption keys with you. Is this approach addressing the problem of safety/security of the data on the cloud effectively?
So I think encrypting, the encryption algorithms themselves, like AES, for example, aren't really the issue. It's really the key management, right? Key management's the real issue. When you think about breaches that have occurred in the past that involve encryption systems, it's almost always key management, until we get to quantum computing, and then all bets are off. I do think that these are table stakes today, and I think the fact that companies can bring your own key or hold your own key, essentially trying to mitigate that risk of that multi-tenancy risk in terms of a breach someplace else affecting you. I think this is the fact that we can do those things, we can own our own keys, is one of the reasons why financial services are at the table now talking about cloud. That CASB layer, the cloud access security broker layer that allows firms to get some comfort that the keys are theirs, I think is absolutely extremely important.
Yeah, to add to that, what I think is a great opportunity for financial services when they move to the cloud is how easy cloud providers have made it to have encryption everywhere. So all of your infrastructure, all of your network in transit, it's almost click of a button or turnkey. If you want encryption using algorithms like AES 256, you just check a box. Now, on-premise, it's very difficult to run key management infrastructure at the scale required to encrypt hundreds of thousands of servers on-premise. And I think you might agree with this. What we see in an on-premise world is financial institutions focusing their encryption capability on maybe the most sensitive data in their organization, but then there's still large portions of sensitive data that largely goes unencrypted. And the reason for that is key management is difficult at scale. And I think one of the great things that cloud providers have brought to the table is because they have to fix this once for millions of customers, they've done a really good job of automating it and making it accessible for everyone. And I think that's an opportunity that financial institutions, as you mentioned, that's why they're at the table talking, can take that immediate benefit of encryption everywhere.
Yeah, and I do think that just real quickly, so I was reading the question again, it is addressing the problem of safety and security, but it's not the end all. It's not the end state, right? So encryption technology is it's not quite where we need it to be at the moment. So field level encryption today is very difficult to do. Separating segregation of duties of individuals that have privileged access and have the capability of decrypting keys and then seeing a company's data, that's not quite where we need it to be either. definitely trending in the right direction. Definitely much more comfortable now than, security professionals are much more comfortable now than they ever were because of that. But we're not quite there yet.
Okay, well, I've got 15 seconds in which to sneak the very last and most popular question today. So, right to inspect and right to audit, a tug-of-war game between the regulators, financial institutions, and cloud service providers. What's your experience on that?
Yeah, oh, there you go, great. All right. Look, I think that's a tough one, right? I mean, let me talk systemically, and I wouldn't call me the super best qualified for this, but I'm going to try and do it based on the best I understand. I think we have a systemic obligation to ensure that the industry, if we're talking about the financial services industry, is secure and safe.
Yeah.
And the ability to audit and the ability to understanding the environment is something very important, especially for those that are providing a duty of care to customers. Yeah. So the fact that you want it, I think, and the fact that you're requesting it from our cloud providers is actually okay, right? There's no reason we shouldn't be asking that question. The next level you have to get to is, can we do it, right? And how do you do it? And so that's where we need to work with our regulators and the cloud providers to say, what is an efficient way to ensure that systemically we can protect the environment, the customer, and the system? The cloud service provider wants our business in the game, does not want us to go out of business. The regulator wants to protect the system. We want our clients to be happy. There's a successful entendre that I think could be had, and I think that's the balance that you need to strike. The conversations now are happening much more than they ever did before, so I'm seeing regulator, cloud provider, customer talking in ways I haven't seen before and being very transparent.
And actually, I would end this panel talk by saying that seems to me to be the common theme, really, which is the conversation between all the various different stakeholders, which will get us to a place of successful use of cloud. So it just remains to me to thank very much each of our panelists. Matt, Pierre, Mars, I think you've done a fantastic job. I, for one, definitely feel well educated and slightly less scared from reading all the press I've read. And Matt, if Morgan Stanley won't use cloud next time I try, I know at least who to call. So thank you very much.